She'd been on the job for 19 years. She'd faced drug lords, domestic calls gone wrong, and a courtroom that tried to break her twice. But nothing, prepared her for lying bleeding on a cold stretch of highway at 2 a.m. with no one coming. Her radio was dead. Her cruiser was on its side. And the last thing she expected to see pulling up in the darkness was a Hell's Angel. What that man chose to do next didn't just save her life. It started a war inside the police department that no one saw coming. But before we go any further, drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching this from. Could be a small town, could be a big city, could be somewhere in between. Wherever you are, I want to know. Because the people who find their way to stories like this one tend to be a particular kind of person. The kind who still believes that what someone does in the dark, when no one is watching and there's nothing to gain, says everything about who they actually are. If that sounds like you, you're exactly where you need to be. And if this is your first time here, welcome. Hit subscribe before this video is over, because this is the kind of channel that finds the stories most people never hear. The ones that happen on dark roads, and in hospital rooms, and in the quiet interior of a decision that nobody planned and everybody needed. Stay with me, because what happened on Route 9 in the early hours of October 14th didn't begin with a crash, and it didn't end with an ambulance. It began, the way most things that matter begin, long before anyone knew it was starting. In the life of a woman who had spent 19 years doing the right thing inside a system that had spent nearly as long making sure she paid for it. And in the life of a man who had spent just as long being told, in every language institutions know how to speak, that he was not the kind of person whose instincts deserved to be trusted. They were both wrong about each other before they ever met. The road made sure they found out. This is their story, and it will stay with you. Her father used to say that the badge wasn't something you wore, it was something you carried. He wore the badge for 23 years in a mid-sized Pennsylvania town where the police weren't a distant authority. They were the neighborhood. They coached Little League. They knew which families needed groceries in December and made sure those groceries arrived without anyone having to ask. Patrice grew up watching her father be that kind of man. She became that kind of woman. She joined the force at 26, not because she couldn't think of anything else to do, not because she needed the benefits, but because she genuinely believed, and this is the part that matters, she genuinely believed that the work meant something. That showing up at 2 in the morning, that being the calm voice in a moment of panic, that standing between someone's worst night and something even worse, she believed that was worth a life. Worth her life. By the time 19 years had passed, most of her colleagues would have told you the same thing about Patrice Delgado. She was the officer you wanted on your call. Not the loudest, not the most decorated, but the one who remembered people's names. The one who followed up. The one who, when a situation could go sideways, had a way of keeping it level with nothing more than patience and a voice that didn't rise when everyone else's did. Her arrest record was solid. Her complaint record was nearly clean. In 2 decades of work, not one credible allegation of misconduct. In a profession where that alone is notable, it said something. She worked nights by choice. Had for years. The day shift, she'd say, was fine, busy, visible, good for people who needed the energy of it. But the night had a The world at 3 in the morning didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. She kept her cruiser organized the way some people keep a kitchen. Everything in its place, everything with a purpose. And in the back seat, secured against the rear panel, she always kept an extra trauma kit. Not the standard issue one in the trunk. Her own. Stocked and checked and ready. She'd bought it herself, years back, after arriving at a scene where the department kit had run low and someone had needed more than was there. She never let that happen again on her watch. You never know who's going to need it, she'd say, when the younger officers asked about it. Could be anyone. Could be a stranger. Could be you. She'd been fighting for her place in that department for longer than most of her colleagues had been on the force. But on the night of October 14th, none of that would matter. What would matter is what she kept in the back seat of her cruiser. Raymond Hollis was not the kind of man who introduced himself by his given name. Inside the chapter, inside the world he'd built for himself over 3 decades of gravel roads and pre-dawn rides, and the particular brotherhood that forms when men choose loyalty over convenience. Inside that world, he was roadblock. Had been since his early 30s, when he was known for being the one guy in any situation who simply would not move until he was ready to move. Not out of stubbornness, exactly. Out of something quieter than that. a kind of stillness that some people mistook for slowness and learned, eventually, was neither. He was 58 years old, built like a man who'd done physical work his entire life and never thought much about it. He had a face that had been outside in all kinds of weather, and hands that showed every year of it, and eyes that were, if you paid attention, if you looked past the patches and the posture and whatever story you'd already written about him before he walked in the room. Careful, watchful, not hostile, careful. His history was not clean. He'd done 3 years in his mid-30s after a bar fight that escalated past where he intended it to go. There was a DA in that county who was running for re-election on a tough-on-crime platform and needed cases that looked good in a press release. There was a public defender who was carrying 47 cases simultaneously and knew Raymond's name primarily from the file folder. The outcome was 3 years. Raymond did the time without complaint and came out the other side with 2 things he hadn't fully understood before he went in: the precise value of freedom and a permanent wariness of institutions that held power over people's lives. He was not a villain. He was not a saint. He was a man shaped by his world the same way Patrice Delgado was shaped by hers, by the particular pressures and lessons and disappointments that accumulate when you're living a real life instead of a theoretical one. The chapter he rode with had a long and complicated relationship with local law enforcement. Some of what the department had thrown at them over the years had been legitimate. Some of it had been harassment dressed up in procedure, surveillance that went nowhere, stops that produced nothing, raids that seemed designed more to send a message than to enforce any actual law. Raymond had been on the receiving end of both kinds, and he'd learned to tell the difference, even when the officers involved had not. What most people never saw, what didn't fit the easy version of the story, was the Sunday phone call. Every week, without fail, Raymond called his daughter. She was 31 now, living in North Carolina with a job she loved and a life that was going well, and their relationship had been built back slowly and carefully after years when it wasn't much of anything. He called every Sunday. She picked up every Sunday. That had taken time. He didn't take it for granted. Here's something worth pausing on for a moment, because it matters to what comes later. Studies tracking emergency roadside incidents across the United States have found that biker communities, and Hells Angels chapters specifically, account for a quietly significant number of Good Samaritan stops. Motorists pulled from wrecked vehicles, drivers flagged down for help, people in medical distress on remote roads who got help because a rider happened to pass. The vast majority of these incidents go undocumented. Nobody files a report on a kind act. Nobody issues a press release when a man on a motorcycle stops because another human being needed him to. The stories exist. They just don't travel far. Keep that in mind. On the night of October 14th, Raymond Hollis was riding home alone after a chapter meeting that had run long. His usual route was a road he'd ridden so many times he could have navigated it without his headlight. Every curve memorized, every landmark familiar. But that road had been partially closed for construction since the previous week, and the detour the signs pushed him on to added 3 miles and sent him east, onto Route 9. If Ray had taken his normal route home that night, the one he'd ridden 1,000 times, none of this would have ever happened. But a construction detour pushed him 3 miles east. 3 miles that would change 2 lives and rattle an entire police force to its core. Every institution has 2 versions of itself. There's the version on the website, the mission statement, the community policing initiative, the carefully worded commitment to service and integrity. And then there's the version that exists in the break room at 2 in the morning, in the hallway conversations that stop when the wrong person walks by, in the paperwork that gets filed and the paperwork that quietly disappears. Most people who work inside institutions long enough learn to navigate the distance between those 2 versions. They learn which battles to pick. They learn what silence costs and what speaking costs more. Patrice Delgado learned that lesson the hard way, and she learned it more than once. The first time came about 7 years into her career. She was working a Friday night shift when she responded to a call that had already been handled by another officer before she arrived, a domestic situation in a neighborhood where the department had history. The other officer, a man named Carver who'd been on the force for 15 years and was friendly with most of the senior staff, had logged the call as resolved with no incident. Patrice had seen enough of the apartment, enough of the woman standing in the doorway with her arms crossed in that particular way people hold themselves when they're trying not to show how scared they are, to know that resolved wasn't the right word. She asked the woman privately if she wanted to make a statement. The woman said no. Patrice left her card. She went back to her cruiser and sat for a long moment with her hands on the wheel. She did not file a supplemental report. She told herself it was because there was nothing to report. She knew, even then, that wasn't entirely true. The second time was subtler. A senior officer in her precinct had a pattern of logging overtime hours that didn't match his shift records. It wasn't her case, wasn't her paperwork, but she'd seen enough of the documentation in passing to recognize that something wasn't adding up. A colleague she trusted pulled her aside one afternoon and said, simply, "That's not a door you want to open." She didn't open it. She filed that knowledge somewhere in the back of her mind and kept doing her job and told herself that one person couldn't fix everything. That was true. It was also convenient. The third time, she didn't look away. A fellow officer, young, 2 years on the force, a man named Decker who had grown into the kind of authority the badge gave him a little too quickly and a little too comfortably, had been the subject of 3 informal complaints from residents in a particular neighborhood. Not formal complaints, the kind that get made to other officers, to community liaisons, to anyone who might listen without the conversation becoming official. Patrice had heard all 3 independently. And unlike the first 2 times, she wrote it down. She filed a formal internal complaint with documentation, with names where she had permission to use them, with dates and incident descriptions. She did it by the book, precisely because she knew someone would be looking for a reason to dismiss it. The complaint went to Sergeant Vance Pruitt. Pruitt had been running the night shift for 11 years. He was the kind of man who understood organizational power the way a chess player understands the board, not in terms of what was right, but in terms of what could be moved and what couldn't, what was protected and what was exposed. He had built, over more than a decade, a careful ecosystem of loyalty and debt inside that precinct. He did favors. He remembered them. He protected people who were useful to him, and he had a long memory for anyone who threatened something he'd built. Decker was one of his. Not a close relationship, nothing that obvious. But Pruitt had vouched for him early, had written a favorable evaluation in Decker's first year, had made a small but meaningful investment in his career. When Patrice's complaint landed on Pruitt's desk, it wasn't just a complaint about a junior officer. It was, in the particular arithmetic of men like Pruitt, a challenge, a statement, a declaration that Patrice Delgado was not someone who understood how things worked around here. The complaint was reviewed and closed with no action taken. The documentation Patrice had submitted was described, in the formal response, as insufficiently specific to warrant further investigation. Decker received no formal reprimand. He was, within 8 months, assigned to a more desirable shift rotation. Patrice received no formal reprimand either. What she received was something quieter and more effective. The next time her promotion application came up for review, it moved through the process and then simply stopped. No denial issued. No explanation offered. Just silence. She followed up twice in writing. Both inquiries were acknowledged and then absorbed into the particular institutional stillness that Pruitt was very good at maintaining around anything he wanted to stay buried. He controlled the paperwork. He controlled who reviewed it and when and with what level of attention. In a system where advancement required the endorsement of people above you, Pruitt had positioned himself directly between Patrice and every door she might have walked through. He didn't need to do anything dramatic. He just needed to do nothing, consistently, for long enough that the message arrived without ever being spoken aloud. The message was, know your place. There was one more layer to this, and it's important because it shapes everything that comes later. The department where Patrice worked had an unspoken but thoroughly understood policy when it came to motorcycle clubs, and Hell's Angels in particular. Stop them when you can justify it. Document their movements. Treat every interaction as potentially adversarial. The official language, when anyone bothered to use official language, was about organized crime and public safety. The operational reality was something closer to standing presumption of guilt. You saw the patch, you saw a problem. That was the culture. It had been the culture for years. Nobody had written it down. Nobody needed to. It was transmitted the way most institutional cultures are transmitted. Through 100 small moments of imitation and approval, through the stories senior officers told and the behaviors they rewarded, through the tone Pruitt set every single shift about what kind of people deserved the benefit of the doubt and what kind of people didn't. Patrice had never been entirely comfortable with it. She'd also never pushed back on it directly. It was, she told herself, one of the hills she hadn't chosen to die on. She had enough of those already. Before we get to the night, everything changed. If you've ever worked inside a system that made you feel invisible, that took your best work and buried it, that rewarded the wrong people and punished the right ones, you're going to understand exactly what Patrice Delgado was carrying on the night of October 14th. If any part of what she lived through feels familiar, drop a comment right now. Just say, "I see you, Patrice." Let's fill this section with people who know what it means to do the right thing in a place that doesn't reward it. And if you're watching this and you genuinely cannot stand watching good people get overlooked while men like Pruitt run the room, hit subscribe. The trolls who think Pruitt was just doing his job won't. Let's make sure they're outnumbered. Route 9 at that hour was the kind of dark that cities never quite manage. Not the dim dark of streetlights and parking lots and the ambient glow of 1,000 lit windows, the real dark. The kind that exists where the road runs out ahead of your headlight and the trees close in on both sides, and the only sound is the engine beneath you, and the wind moving past your helmet, and the occasional punctuation of something small crossing the asphalt somewhere beyond what you can see. Raymond Hollis had ridden in that kind of dark hundreds of times. It didn't bother him. He knew how to be alone with the road and his own thoughts, knew how to let the miles pass without needing anything from them. He was tired in the comfortable way a man gets tired after a long evening among people he trusted, not depleted, just settled, ready for home. The detour had added time he hadn't planned for, but the road was empty and the night was clear, and he was making good progress. He came around the long bend at the eastern edge of Route 9. A curve he'd never taken before tonight, on a stretch of road that wasn't his, and his headlights swept across something that didn't belong. The reflection came first, a flash of it, catching the light at a wrong angle, the particular way metal reflects when it's not sitting the way metal is supposed to sit. His eyes found it before his brain named it, and then his brain caught up, and what it named was a police cruiser. On its side, in the ditch. The undercarriage facing out toward the road, the single rear wheel still, the dark shape of it half swallowed by the slope of the embankment. He felt his body respond before he made any conscious decision. His right hand eased back on the throttle. His speed dropped. The bike slowed. And then everything he'd learned in 20 years of being on the wrong side of that particular badge moved through him like a current. Not your problem. He knew what this looked like. He knew what it meant, in practical terms, for a man with his history and his patches to be found at the scene of a downed police cruiser in the middle of the night on an empty road. He knew how that story got written before anyone asked him a single question. Had worn it against his skin for most of his adult life. They hate you. They'll thank you by arresting you. He slowed to almost nothing. His boots found the asphalt. He sat there on his idling bike in the dark and looked at the wreckage and felt the full weight of every reason to keep going pressing against him. He sat for a moment, maybe two, maybe longer, long enough for the decision to feel real, to feel like something with consequences, to feel like a choice rather than a reflex. And then he heard it, a voice, coming from inside the wreckage or near it. He couldn't tell immediately. Small, not a scream, not the sharp animal sound of someone in sudden shock. Something quieter than that. Something that had been going for a while already, maybe, and had gotten quieter because the person making it had been alone long enough to wonder if anyone was ever going to hear it. Help. Just that. One word, worn thin at the edges. Raymond Hollis was off his bike before he decided to be. That is the only way to say it accurately. His body made the choice, while something else in him was still weighing the cost of it. His boots hit the gravel at the road's edge, and he was moving toward the ditch, toward the wreckage, toward that small voice. And the part of him that had been cataloging every reason to keep riding was simply no longer in charge. He came down the embankment carefully, one hand on the cruiser's frame to steady himself, and that's when he saw her. Through the shattered side window, now facing skyward. A woman in a torn uniform, one arm held against her body at an angle that told him immediately it was broken, a dark stain spreading at her temple, her eyes open and finding his face in the dark with an expression that contained, all at once, relief and fear and something that might have been disbelief. She was alive. She was hurt badly. And she had been alone out here for long enough that her voice had gotten that small. He crouched at the window. He kept his voice level. "I've got you," he said. "I'm right here." He wasn't looking at her patches, and she wasn't looking at his. They were just two people on a dark road, and one of them needed help, and the other one had stopped. It was in those first few seconds, crouched at the window with the night pressing in around them, that Raymond noticed something else. Scattered in the debris near the passenger side of the cruiser, pushed out by the impact or shaken loose from somewhere inside, was a manila folder, its contents fanned slightly across the gravel. Papers. Documents of some kind. He couldn't read them in the dark. He didn't touch them. He registered them the way a careful man registers details he doesn't yet understand, filed them somewhere quiet in the back of his mind, and turned his full attention back to the woman who needed him. He would think about those papers later. What Ray did in the next 47 minutes would eventually be reviewed by a use of force board, scrutinized by a police union, and debated in the pages of 3 newspapers. But in that moment, none of that existed. There was just a man and a woman and a dark road. The first thing Raymond did was talk to her. Before he assessed anything, before he reached for anything, before he did a single practical thing, he talked to her. He told her his name. He told her he was going to stay right there. He told her help was coming, which was not yet true, but which he intended to make true. And he said it in the particular tone of a man who understood that what a person in shock needs before they need anything else is the sound of another human being who is not panicking. She told him her name was Patrice. He said, "Good. Keep talking, Patrice." He assessed her arm first, because it was the most visible injury, and because the angle of it told him everything he needed to know. A clean stabilization was possible, but she needed to not move it, and the instinct to move it when you're frightened and in pain is nearly impossible to override without something holding it in place. He took off his belt. It was wide leather, the kind that had some real substance to it, and he fashioned it into a stabilizer with the efficient practicality of a man who'd done wilderness first aid training years back and had retained the parts that mattered. He worked carefully and explained every step before he did it, because he'd learned long ago that what makes pain worse, more often than not, is not knowing what's coming next. She winced when he secured it. She didn't make a sound beyond that. He remembered the trauma kit then, had registered the standard issue box still mounted inside the cruiser when he'd first looked through the window. Getting to it required maneuvering through the broken window space and reaching across the inverted interior without disturbing her or the frame. He did it slowly, methodically, and when he got the kit down and opened it, he found what he needed: gauze, medical tape, an emergency blanket that crinkled when he unfolded it, and a pair of gloves he pulled on without being asked to. He dressed the wound at her temple. She watched his face while he worked. He kept his expression steady because he knew she was reading it for information about how bad it was, and what she needed to read there was calm. "What's your name?" she asked again, quieter this time. He understood why she was asking again. She was checking herself, making sure she was still tracking. He told her again. "Raymond." "Ray." "Your patch," she said. Her eyes had moved to his chest. He didn't look down. He knew what she was seeing. "I know what you're thinking," he said, and his voice was quiet and without any edge in it. No defensiveness, no performance of patience, just the plain acknowledgement of a man who had been in this situation enough times, in enough variations, to have made his peace with it. "You can think it later. Right now you just keep talking to me." She looked at him for a moment. Something moved across her face that was hard to name. Not quite the thing she'd arrived with. Not quite something new yet. Somewhere in between. She kept talking. They talked about small things, the way people do when the big things are too large to hold. He asked her if she had family. She said a son, 16, lived with his father during the week. She asked if he rode far. He said far enough. She said she'd always thought motorcycles looked cold at night. He said you got used to it. The conversation was ordinary, and it was also everything, because every word she spoke was confirmation that she was still there, still present, still holding on to the thread of the evening. 20 minutes passed, maybe a little more. Route 9 stayed dark and empty in both directions, the way roads do when you need them least to be. And then headlights appeared from the north. A passing car, moving at highway speed, the kind of vehicle that might have gone right by without registering what it was passing. Raymond stood up, moved to the road's edge, and put himself where he could not be missed. He flagged the car down with both arms, wide and certain, the unmistakable signal of a man who needed the car to stop and was going to make sure it did. It stopped. He spoke to the driver for less than 30 seconds. He gave them the location, told them what to tell the dispatcher, and asked them to pull off the road and keep their hazards on until the ambulance arrived. They did exactly that. People usually do, Raymond had found, when you talk to them plainly and tell them exactly what you need. He went back to Patrice. The ambulance arrived 24 minutes later. Two paramedics came down the embankment with a board and a kit and the focused efficiency of people who had done this many times, and Raymond stepped back to give them the space they needed and watched them work with the quiet attentiveness of a man making sure things were being done right. When the lead paramedic glanced up at him, he gave a brief accounting. The arm stabilization, the head wound, the emergency blanket, the timeline, approximately how long she'd been conscious and responsive when he arrived. The paramedic nodded and turned back to his work without ceremony. Patrice was loaded onto the board. She turned her head and found Raymond in the dark before they moved her. She said something to him. It was quiet enough that the paramedics didn't catch it. He nodded once. He watched them carry her up the embankment, and then he turned and began walking back toward his bike. He had taken perhaps a dozen steps when he heard boots on asphalt behind him and a voice, young, tight with adrenaline, carrying the particular pitch of authority being deployed before it's had time to properly assess the situation, say, "Hey, stop right there. Don't move." Raymond stopped. He did not turn quickly. He turned the way a man turns when he has nothing to hide and a great deal of experience with moments exactly like this one, slowly, deliberately, with his hands where they could be seen. The deputy was young, mid-20s at most. His hand was near his hip and his jaw was set, and he was looking at the patches on Raymond's jacket with the expression of a man who had already written the first paragraph of the story he was telling himself. Raymond said nothing for a moment. He let the deputy look. Then he said, quietly and without hostility, "My name is Raymond Hollis. My ID is in my left front pocket. The officer in that ambulance, she can tell you what happened here." He paused. "I'm the one who found her." He reached slowly for his ID, extended it, and then he did one more thing. He pointed toward the ambulance where Patrice was being loaded, and he kept his eyes on the deputy's face, and he waited with the patience of a man who had learned, across 58 years of living, that dignity was not something another person could take from you. They could try, but it was yours to keep or surrender, and Raymond Hollis had never been willing to surrender it. The deputy took the ID, said nothing. Raymond waited. Patrice Delgado spent the first night in the hospital drifting in and out of a medicated sleep that was less restful than it was necessary, the kind of sleep that the body demands after trauma regardless of what the mind wants to do. She had a broken arm, 3 cracked ribs, a concussion that the attending physician described as moderate but worth watching, and a laceration at her temple that had required 11 stitches. She was alive. She was going to stay alive. Those were the facts that mattered most, and she held them close in the hours when the pain medication wore thin and the ceiling of her hospital room became the primary thing she had to look at. The paramedics who had brought her in had talked to the ER staff the way paramedics do, efficiently, factually, and with the particular human need to contextualize a call that had been unusual. They described the scene. They described the stabilization of her arm, the dressed wound, the emergency blanket, the fact that her vital signs when they arrived were more stable than they had any right to be given how long she'd been out there and how hard she'd been hit. They described the man who had done all of it, the patches on his jacket, the calm way he delivered his account, and stepped back to give them room to work. The ER nurse who admitted Patrice that night was a woman who had worked that unit for 14 years and had seen enough to know that the story she'd just heard was not a usual one. She didn't use names. She didn't identify the department or the road or any detail that would point to a specific person. What she posted on her personal social media account, sometime around 4 in the morning, was brief and carefully vague. Something about the night reminding her why she believed in human beings, about a stranger on a dark road who had no reason to stop and stopped anyway, about the kind of goodness that doesn't announce itself. She added nothing more than that. It was enough. By the following evening, the post had been shared several hundred times. By the morning after that, a local reporter at a regional news outlet had connected enough of the threads. The incident report, a source inside the paramedic unit, a brief and carefully worded confirmation from the hospital's communications office to publish a story. It ran under a headline that was simple and declarative and contained everything most readers needed to know to click on it. Hell's Angel saves officer's life on Route 9. Uncomplicated, generous, the particular relief people feel when a story turns out to be about human decency rather than the alternative. The comments filled quickly. People shared the article with notes attached. Local radio picked it up by midday. A television station 2 counties over had a crew trying to get an interview with Raymond before the week was out. People who had never met Patrice Delgado and had never thought much about the Hells Angels found themselves, for a few days at least, thinking about what it means when the person who shows up for you is the person you'd been taught not to trust. The story spread the way good stories spread, not because anyone manufactured it, but because it was true and people recognized something in it that they needed to recognize. Sergeant Vance Pruitt's response was different. He called Patrice on the second day of her hospital stay. She was sitting up in bed, her arm in a temporary cast, the television on but muted, a cup of lukewarm coffee on the tray beside her that her son had brought that morning before school. She saw Pruitt's name on the screen and felt something tighten in her chest that had nothing to do with her cracked ribs. She answered. He opened with pleasantries, asked how she was feeling, said the department was glad she was going to be all right. Said all of the correct things in the correct order with the particular fluency of a man who had made many calls like this one and knew exactly how they were supposed to sound. And then he got to the point. He told her he'd seen the news coverage. He said, and his tone remained warm throughout, never hardening, never dropping the register of collegial concern, that he thought it was important for her to be careful about how she characterized what had happened out there. That in situations like this, with the media attention being what it was, things could get complicated. That there would be questions, he said, about the sequence of events, about how the crash had occurred. Just that it might be worth considering whether a man with Raymond's history, on that particular road at that particular hour, might have had some involvement in the incident itself. He said it the way men like Pruitt say things they want on the table without being seen to put them there, carefully, with plausible distance, wrapped in the language of reasonable caution. He finished by saying that she might want to think about whether publicly validating someone like that was the right move for her career, for the department, for the integrity of what was still technically an open investigation into the crash. Patrice listened to all of it. She said very little. She said she appreciated him calling. She said she was tired and needed to rest. She hung up, and she stared at the ceiling of her hospital room. The same ceiling she'd been staring at for 2 days, the one that had become, in the long quiet hours of her recovery, a kind of canvas for everything she was thinking and not yet saying. She lay there with her broken arm and her cracked ribs and her 11 stitches and the memory of a man crouched at a shattered window in the dark telling her to keep talking to him, and she thought about what Vance Pruitt had just asked her to do. He had called her while she was still in a hospital bed. He had suggested, with careful words and a warm voice, that the man who had stabilized her arm and dressed her wound and held her hand and flagged down help on an empty road might have been the one who put her in the ditch. He had told her, in the language that men like him had perfected over decades of institutional management, to stay quiet, to not validate, to protect the narrative over the truth. She stared at the ceiling. She didn't say anything to anyone that day. She drank her cold coffee and watched the muted television and let her son talk about his week when he visited after school, and she listened to him with the full attention of a mother who understood, perhaps more clearly than she ever had before, exactly what kind of world she was going to leave him. Sergeant Pruitt, with Patrice still in a hospital bed, tried to get her to stay quiet. If that makes your blood boil, good. Drop a comment below right now. Pruitt was wrong. Let's see how many people believe that a woman who nearly died deserves better than a phone call telling her to manage the narrative. And if you're watching this and you believe that good deeds shouldn't be buried, share this video. Put it in front of someone who needs to see it. Because stories like this one are exactly the kind that people in power hope never travel too far. Let's make sure this one does. She went home on a Thursday. Her son helped her through the front door and into the chair by the window that had always been her chair. The one with the worn armrest on the left side and the particular angle that caught the afternoon light without putting it directly in your eyes. And he made her soup that came from a can, but was offered with the kind of earnest care that made it taste like something more than that. He was 16 and trying not to show how frightened he'd been, which meant he talked more than usual and kept finding reasons to be in whatever room she was in. She let him. She understood what he needed, and what he needed was to see her sitting upright and present and not going anywhere. She healed slowly, the way the body heals when it has been genuinely damaged and cannot be rushed. The ribs were the worst of it in the early days. That particular pain that makes every breath a small negotiation, that reminds you with each inhale that the body is not invincible and never was. She slept in the recliner for the first week because lying flat was not yet something she could manage. She watched the morning come through the window, and she thought. She had a great deal of time to think. She thought about 19 years, about the shape of them. Not the highlights, not the moments that made it into commendations or performance reviews, but the texture of the thing. The accumulated weight of 2 decades spent inside an institution that had taken her best work and her best judgment and her best years and had returned, in exchange, a series of quiet diminishments so carefully spaced that it was easy, if you weren't paying attention, to mistake them for bad luck rather than policy. She thought about the complaint she'd filed against Decker, about the way it had been received and processed and buried, about how she'd watched that happen and told herself it was one battle, one hill, not worth the cost of dying on it. She thought about all the hills she hadn't died on. There were more of them than she'd realized, laid out in sequence like that, more than she was comfortable counting. She thought about the promotions, about the men who had received them, about the paperwork she'd submitted with meticulous care, the evaluations she'd earned, the years of service she'd accumulated, and about Vance Pruitt's hand resting on all of it like a stone, silent and immovable and never quite visible enough to name directly. She thought about his voice on the phone, velvet smooth and cold underneath. Be careful about how you characterize what happened. She turned that sentence over in her mind the way you turn over something you found on the ground. Examining it, understanding it more fully the longer you hold it. And then she thought about Ray. She thought about crouching in an overturned cruiser on a dark road with her arm broken and her head bleeding and the radio dead, and the particular quality of alone that she had felt in those 20 minutes before his headlight came around the bend. She thought about the sound of boots on gravel coming toward her instead of away. She thought about his voice, level, unhurried, telling her to keep talking. And about his hands working carefully on her arm, explaining each step before he took it. She thought about the emergency blanket crinkling in the night air and the way he'd flagged down the passing car with both arms, wide and certain, a man who needed something done and was going to make sure it got done. She thought about his face when she'd looked at his patch. The way he'd absorbed her reaction without flinching, without defending himself, without asking for anything in return for what he was already giving her. You can think it later. Right now you just keep talking to me. He had held her hand when she asked him to. On a dark road with no audience and no reward and every institutional reason in the world to have kept writing. He had held her hand. For 19 years, Patrice had been told that keeping quiet was how you survived inside that department. Now, for the first time, she asked herself, survive to do what? The question didn't feel rhetorical. It felt like the most serious question she'd ever asked herself, and it deserved a serious answer. She sat with it for several days. She turned it over the way she'd turned over Pruitt's sentence, examining it from every angle, understanding it more fully the longer she held it. She thought about her son in the next room, 16 years old, and paying attention to everything whether he appeared to be or not. She thought about what she wanted him to see when he looked at her. Not the version that had survived by staying in her lane. The other version. The one that had been waiting, she understood now, for long enough. She made her decision on a Tuesday morning, 11 days after she'd come home from the hospital. She made it quietly, the way she made most things. Without ceremony, without announcement, with the particular resolve of a woman who had thought something all the way through and arrived at the end of her thinking and found, standing there, a choice that was not really a choice at all. She picked up her phone. She found the number for the reporter who had broken the partial story, the one who had been careful with the details she'd had, who had gotten the facts right in a situation where getting facts right required actual effort. Patrice had read the article twice in the hospital. She'd noted what the reporter had included and, more importantly, what she'd left out when she didn't have confirmation. That mattered. That was the kind of journalist worth talking to. She called the number. The reporter answered on the third ring. Patrice said, I think it's time to tell the whole story. With his name. With everything. If you still want it. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Then the reporter said yes. She said it in the way people say yes when they've been hoping for something and have been professional enough not to push for it. They arranged to meet the following morning. Patrice hung up the phone and sat for a moment in her chair by the window, in the afternoon light, with her healing arm and her healing ribs and the particular stillness of a woman who has just done something that cannot be undone and has no desire to undo it. Outside, the street was quiet. Ordinary. A neighbor walked a dog. A car passed slowly. The world continued at its usual pace, entirely unaware that something had just shifted inside a house on an unremarkable street. Something small and private and, in its own way, enormous. The full story ran on a Friday morning. Patrice's account, complete and unredacted, with Raymond Hollis named in full, with the timeline reconstructed in careful detail, with the 47 minutes accounted for from the moment his headlight found the wreckage to the moment the deputy had stopped him on the road with his hand near his hip. The reporter had done her work thoroughly, and the piece showed it. Not sensationalized, not softened, just the facts of what had happened laid out in sequence and allowed to speak for themselves. They spoke loudly. National pickup came within 18 hours. Wire services, morning television, the kind of organic spread that no publicist can manufacture and no algorithm fully explains, the spread that happens when a story touches something people have been carrying without a name for it. The particular relief of being shown, in concrete and undeniable terms, that the world is sometimes better than you feared it was. Raymond gave one interview. He did not seek it out. The reporter had tracked down a contact who knew the chapter, and a request had been passed along, and Raymond had agreed with the same quiet deliberateness with which he did most things. He sat across from the camera without performance, without the self-conscious awareness of a man who wanted to be seen a certain way, and he answered questions in the spare and direct manner of someone who didn't believe in saying more than what was true. He said he'd stopped because someone needed help. He said anyone would have done it. He said it without false modesty. He genuinely appeared to believe it, which was perhaps the most striking thing about him. He didn't describe himself as a hero. He described himself as someone who had been on that road at that time and had made the only decision that made sense to him. That clip went everywhere. Inside the department, the reaction fractured along lines that had been forming for years without anyone formally acknowledging them. Several officers contacted Patrice privately, by text, by voicemail, in one case by a handwritten note left in her departmental mailbox, to say they were glad she'd spoken, that they'd been watching what had been happening to her for a long time, that it mattered that she'd said something. These messages came quietly, without signatures in some cases, from people who understood that the walls had ears and that Vance Pruitt had a memory for disloyalty. Others went cold. Conversations that stopped when she walked into a room. Responses to her messages that became clipped and administrative. The precise temperature drop that institutions produce when someone has stepped outside the understood boundaries, and the people who benefit from those boundaries are registering their displeasure. And a few, a small number, but vocal, began openly questioning Raymond's account. Not with evidence. There was no evidence to question it with. But with the tone of men who had decided what the story should be and were working backward from that conclusion, suggesting in break-room conversations and union meetings that things might not be as straightforward as the media was making them seem. Pruitt moved within the week. He initiated what he described, in the formal paperwork, as a routine and formal review of Patrice's conduct and decision-making on the night of the crash. The language was procedural and unremarkable. The timing was not. Everyone who understood how that department worked understood exactly what the review was and what it was designed to accomplish. Not to find anything, but to place something on record, to create a file, to establish, in the institutional architecture that Pruitt had spent 11 years building, a counter-narrative that could be deployed if needed. The police union issued a public statement. It thanked the citizen who had assisted Officer Delgado. It expressed gratitude for the community's support, and it included, in its third paragraph, a carefully constructed sentence suggesting that improved departmental response protocols would ensure that officers in distress were located more quickly in future incidents. The statement managed, in 73 words, to thank Raymond while implying the department would have gotten there eventually anyway. It pleased no one. Not the public, not the officers who had reached out to Patrice privately, and certainly not Raymond, who read it once and did not comment on it publicly, which was perhaps the most eloquent response available to him. And then the second journalist appeared. Going back to the original sources, the original documentation, the crime scene materials that had been made part of the public record. He had been going through the photographs, the ones the department itself had released as part of the standard incident documentation. He called Patrice on a Wednesday afternoon. He described what he'd seen in one of the crime scene photographs, taken at the embankment early on the night of the crash, before the area had been cleared. In the lower left corner of the frame, partially visible near the passenger side of the overturned cruiser, was a manila folder, its contents fanned across the gravel. Enough of one page visible to show a department letterhead. He asked her if she knew what was in it. The silence that followed lasted long enough that he asked if she was still there. She was still there. She was thinking about a folder she had been keeping under her passenger seat for 4 months. Copies of internal correspondence, emails and memoranda and evaluation records that documented, in the dry and specific language of institutional paperwork, a pattern of interference in her promotion process that led directly to one name. She had collected it carefully, over time, without telling anyone, without being certain what she intended to do with it. She had not decided. She had simply kept it, the way you keep something you know you might need someday. The crash had made that decision for her. The journalist contacted Raymond to ask about the folder. Raymond confirmed, simply and without embellishment, that he had seen it in the wreckage on the night of the crash. He described its location. He said he hadn't touched it. He said he didn't know what it contained. He said all of this without understanding, fully, what he had just confirmed or what it would become. What it became was evidence. 2 weeks later, Patrice's attorney filed a formal civil rights complaint with the State Oversight Board. The documentation from that folder, authenticated, organized, and submitted in full, formed the evidentiary core of a case that named Vance Pruitt specifically and detailed, across 14 pages, a sustained and deliberate pattern of professional suppression targeting a 19-year veteran officer whose record contained not a single credible mark against her. The folder that had slid from under her seat in the impact of a collision on Route 9. The folder that Raymond Hollis had noticed in the dark and registered with the careful attention of a man who noticed things and had not touched and had not forgotten. The folder that the department's own crime scene photographer had inadvertently captured in the lower left corner of a routine documentation photograph. Sometimes the truth finds its way out not because someone planned it carefully, but because the universe has a particular sense of irony about the people who try to bury it. The complaint triggered an external review within 3 weeks of filing, not an internal one. The State Oversight Board, upon reviewing the initial documentation, determined that an internal review conducted by the same department named in the complaint would not meet the threshold of independence required for a credible investigation. An external team was appointed. Investigators who had no prior relationship with the precinct, no history with its personnel, no investment in any particular outcome. People whose only job was to look at what the document said and follow that thread wherever it led. It led further than anyone had publicly anticipated. The review had been underway for less than 2 weeks when the first of them came forward. A female officer with 11 years on the force, a record that mirrored Patrice's in its quiet excellence and its quiet stagnation, who had watched the complaint become public and had spent several days sitting with a decision she'd been postponing for longer than she wanted to admit. She contacted the Oversight Board directly. She brought her own documentation, not as comprehensive as Patrice's, but specific, dated, and corroborating in ways that mattered. Then a second. 8 years on the force. A different shift, a different direct supervisor, but the same leadership tier. The same pattern of evaluation reviews that went nowhere. The same paperwork that moved and then stopped. The same institutional silence that greeted follow-up inquiries. Then a third. This one had left the department 2 years prior, citing personal reasons in her exit interview, because personal reasons was the language available to her that wouldn't close doors she might need later. She came forward now because the door she'd been protecting turned out to open onto a room she no longer wanted to be in. 3 women, 11 years, 8 years, and 7 years of service respectively. Different shifts, different assignments, different points of contact with the leadership structure above them. The same experience, rendered in different specifics, but recognizable in its architecture. The architecture of a system that had been, for a very long time, making itself comfortable at the expense of the people inside it, who asked too many of the right questions. Vance Pruitt was placed on administrative leave within a month of the external review's commencement. The notification was delivered formally, by the book, with the procedural care that such things require when they involve a senior officer with union representation and 11 years of institutional relationships. He was escorted, quietly and without incident, out of the building he had run his particular kingdom from for over a decade. He would never return to active supervisory duty. The investigation would take several more months to complete. Its findings, when they were released, were detailed and specific and carefully sourced. The kind of document that is written by people who understand that every sentence will be read by attorneys and reviewed by oversight bodies and potentially tested in court, and who write accordingly. The findings confirmed a sustained pattern of discriminatory interference in the promotion processes of multiple female officers. They named Pruitt as the primary architect. They identified 2 other members of the leadership tier who had participated in or enabled the pattern to varying degrees. The department, to its credit, and this matters because credit should go where it belongs, did not fight the findings. The new acting commander, a woman who had been in a different division and had her own complicated history with the precinct's culture, accepted the recommendations in full and initiated a policy review that would take the better part of a year to complete. The centerpiece of what emerged from that review was a restructured promotion process built around blind panel evaluation, a system in which the initial review of applications was conducted by a panel with no prior knowledge of the applicants' identities, their personal relationships within the department, or their history with any individual supervisor. It was a structural change, not a cultural one. Those who understood institutions understood the difference, and understood that the structural change was necessary but not sufficient, and that the cultural one would take longer and require sustained attention and would probably never be fully complete. Systems built over decades do not rebuild themselves in a policy review. They rebuild themselves in the 1,000 daily decisions made by the people inside them, over time, when the people making those decisions have been given both the tools and the genuine institutional will to make them differently. Patrice understood this. She said so, clearly and consistently, in every interview she gave during that period. She did not use the word victory. She was careful about that. Deliberate in a way that the people who knew her recognized as characteristic and the people who didn't know her sometimes mistook for modesty. It wasn't modesty. It was precision. She said it was a beginning. She said that there were good officers in that department, genuinely good ones, people who had come to the work for the right reasons and had been doing it with integrity for years inside a structure that made that harder than it should have been. She said she wanted that acknowledged because it was true and because the story was not, had never been, about condemning everyone inside an institution for the behavior of the people who ran it. She said the people who had sent her quiet messages from unsigned numbers deserved to have their department become what they believed it could be when they joined it. She said she hoped this was the start of that. She said it the way people say things when they mean them, but have also lived long enough to know that meaning something and making it happen are 2 separate projects, and that the second one is longer and harder and less certain than the first. This audience understands that. Anyone who has lived enough years inside enough institutions understands that. Change that matters is slow and uneven and requires more patience than triumph, more maintenance than monument. Patrice Delgado knew it. She'd known it for 19 years. The difference now was that the knowing was no longer something she was carrying alone. The charity event had been on the calendar for months before any of this happened. An annual gathering, modest, unpretentious, held in a community center parking lot with folding tables and donated food, and the particular warmth of people who show up for something not because they're required to, but because they've decided it matters. It raised money for first responder families in financial hardship. Ray's chapter had been quietly supporting it for years. Not loudly, not in a way that sought recognition or generated press releases. They showed up, they contributed, they stayed for a while, and then they rode home. That was the arrangement, and it had been the arrangement long before anyone outside the immediate community knew their names. Patrice came because someone on the organizing committee had reached out and asked if she'd like to attend, and she had said yes without knowing Ray would be there. He didn't know she would be there either. No one had arranged it. No one had thought to. The world has a way, occasionally, of arranging things on its own. The journalist who happened to be covering the event for a regional interest piece saw it unfold from across the parking lot and had the presence of mind to understand what she was witnessing and the decency to witness it quietly. They saw each other across the crowd. There was a moment, brief, legible even from a distance, of mutual recognition. They moved toward each other in the unhurried way of two people who have already said the important things and don't need to rush towards saying them again. He extended his hand. She took it, and then she did something that he clearly had not anticipated. She stepped forward and she hugged him. Not a brief, performative embrace. A real one. The kind that communicates what words have already tried to say and know they fell short of. He didn't know what to do with it for about half a second. That half second was entirely visible and entirely human and entirely Raymond Hollis, the man who had held her hand on a dark road and then walked back to his bike without asking for anything. He stood there for just that moment, and then his arms came up and he hugged her back. She said something to him quietly, her face close enough to his shoulder that whatever she said stayed between them. We don't hear what it is. We don't need to. He nodded once. They separated. There was nothing awkward in it. No searching for what came next. No social machinery grinding to fill the silence. It was simply complete. He walked back to his bike. He put on his helmet with the same unhurried deliberateness with which he did everything. He rode away. On the night of October 14th, Patrice Delgado lay alone on Route 9 and believed no one was coming. She was wrong. And because she was wrong, nothing was ever quite the same again. Not for her, not for Ray, and not for the department that had spent years trying to keep her quiet. Here is what this story is actually about. It isn't about bikers and cops. It isn't about one good deed or one corrupt sergeant or one folder of documents that fell out of a car at the right moment on the wrong night. Those are the details. The story underneath the details is about something that most of us already know but sometimes need to be reminded of in concrete, undeniable terms. Goodness exists where we least expect it. And institutions can fail the very people they're built to serve. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and most of us who have lived long enough have felt both of them. The surprise of being helped by someone we'd written off, and the quiet devastation of being let down by something we trusted. Ray didn't stop on Route 9 because he'd had a change of heart about law enforcement. He stopped because a human being needed help, and he was the one who was there. That's the entire explanation. It doesn't require more architecture than that. Patrice didn't decide to speak because she'd been planning a dramatic moment of institutional confrontation. She decided because a man with every reason to keep riding had chosen not to, and that choice had reminded her, in the most visceral and personal way possible, what it feels like when someone simply shows up. She hadn't felt that inside her own department in a very long time. This pattern exists beyond this story. Across the country, in incidents that mostly go undocumented and unreported, ordinary moments of crossing assumed lines happen constantly. A biker stops. A stranger helps. Someone who was supposed to be the enemy turns out to be the only one who showed up. What they all have in common is simple. They required one person to look at another person and see a person. Nothing more than that. Just that. Sergeant Vance Pruitt called a woman in a hospital bed, a woman with a broken arm and cracked ribs and 11 stitches in her temple, and told her to manage her story. To be careful. To stay quiet. To not validate the man who had held her hand on a dark road when no one else was coming. There are people like that in every institution. In every workplace, in every community, in every system large enough to have a back corridor where the real decisions get made away from anyone watching. They are not always loud. They are often smooth and careful and very good at using the language of procedure to accomplish the goals of self-protection. And their entire model depends on one thing. On good people deciding that speaking up costs too much and staying quiet is the safer bet. They are betting, right now, that you'll watch this and move on. That you won't share it, won't talk about it, won't push back against the version of the world where Pruitt wins and Patrice stays invisible and Ray rides home and nobody ever knows his name. Prove them wrong. If you believe that the man who stopped on Route 9 deserves to be known, hit the like button. If you believe Patrice earned her promotion and deserved to be heard, subscribe to this channel. And in the comments right now, I want you to say 3 words. Pruitt was wrong. Because people like him count on silence. And right now this comment section is anything but silent. One more thing. If there's someone in your life who would love this story, a friend, a spouse, someone who needs to be reminded that goodness still shows up on dark roads, send it to them. Not because we need the views. Because some stories are worth 2 people watching together. I'll see you in the next one.